Duncan, if we don't jump now, we aren't just going to die. We're going to become part of the steel. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, 1943. The world is screaming in a frequency humans were never meant to hear. A thick, claustrophobic shroud of emerald green fog has swallowed the ship, and the laws of biology are unraveling in real time. Edward Cameron watches, paralyzed, as a deckhand beside him begins to vibrate until his atoms drift apart, his torso melting into the bulkhead like wax into a flame. The man's eyes are still moving, pleading, even as his skull fuses with the armored plating. The air tastes of scorched copper and ionized ozone. There is no water over the railing, no horizon, only a shimmering ultraviolet rift tearing through the fabric of the Atlantic. Realizing the ship is becoming a tomb of fused flesh and iron, Edward grips his brother's hand and leaps into the howling void, not into the ocean, but into a hole in the throat of time itself. It is 1988, and the world is defined by the steady hum of CRT televisions and the mundane comfort of the Cold War's twilight. Al Bielek is a man of logic, a calculated electronics salesman who lives a quiet, beige existence. He has a social security number. He has childhood photos. He has a life that makes sense. Until he slides a rented VHS copy of the Philadelphia experiment into his player. As the magnetic tape hisses and the grainy image of a disappearing ship flickers to life, something inside Al's prefrontal cortex shatters. It's not just a memory, it's a total system override. A high-pitched, harmonic ringing erupts in his ears, the exact sound of the Eldridge's generators. The beige walls of his living room seem to ripple, momentarily replaced by the flickering green haze of a laboratory he hasn't seen in 40 years. Violent, strobe light flashes of another life tear through his mind. He sees a man wearing his own face, but younger, dressed in a 1940s Navy uniform. He sees high-voltage vacuum tubes the size of monoliths. He sees a terrifying high-tech throne known as the Montauk Chair. The remote falls from his trembling hand. The terrifying truth hits him with the force of a physical collision. His entire life is a fabrication. Al Bielek is a ghost, a synthetic identity stitched together by government psychiatrists. His childhood is a series of memory masks, implanted narratives designed to hide the fact that he was once Edward Cameron, a genius technician who knew too much. He wasn't born in the 50s. He was age-regressed, mind-wiped, and reborn into a fake family to keep the world's darkest secret buried in his subconscious. But the program has failed. The sleeper has awakened. He remembers the jump now. He remembers falling through the green abyss and waking up in a world that shouldn't exist. He remembers the year 2137, where the geography of Earth has been rewritten by cataclysm, and the year 2749, where humanity is governed by a crystalline artificial intelligence. Most importantly, he remembers being pulled back to 1983 to stop a nightmare, a biological beast pulled straight from the subconscious mind of his own brother. Edward Cameron has spent 40 years living a lie. Now he's ready to tell the truth about where he went when he hit that water, and why the government is terrified that he's back. If you discovered today that your favorite childhood memory was actually a digital file uploaded into your brain by a government lab, would you want to know who you really were, even if it meant being hunted for the rest of your life? Answer yes or no in the comments right now. Don't look away. The timeline is shifting. Subscribe now to enter the Montauk Chair. We're going to the year 2137, and the things we're going to see make the Cold War look like a bedtime story. The transition from the screaming chaos of the Eldridge to the silence of the future wasn't a journey. It was a total sensory collapse. When Edward and Duncan leaped from the railing in 1943, they didn't hit the water. They didn't even hit the ground. They fell through a lightless, pressurized tunnel of non-time that felt like being crushed by an invisible ocean. When Edward finally opens his eyes, the first thing he notices is the light. It's not the flickering yellow of an incandescent bulb or the harsh glare of a military spotlight. It's a soft, sourceless luminescence that seems to emanate from the very walls. The air is sterile, scrubbed of all scent, and strangely heavy. He tries to move, but his limbs feel like lead. His skin is a road map of agony. Vivid, angry radiation burns from the Eldridge's generators have turned his flesh into a weeping mess of blisters. He looks to his left. Duncan is there, in a twin bed, unconscious, his body wrapped in what looks like shimmering, translucent gauze. State Memorial Hospital, year 2137. A figure approaches. It isn't a nurse in a white cap or a doctor with a stethoscope. The individual is wearing a seamless, metallic threaded jumpsuit. They don't speak at first. They move a small handheld device over Edward's chest. It doesn't click. It hums a low, melodic C-sharp. Edward feels a cooling sensation wash over his burns. Within seconds, the searing pain that should have taken months to heal simply evaporates. This is Edward's introduction to the 22nd century. A world where medicine has moved past chemicals and scalpels and into the realm of vibrational frequency. As he recovers over the next 6 weeks, the horror of his situation begins to set in. He asks the staff where he is. They tell him he's in a state-run medical facility. He asks what year it is. When they say 2137, Edward expects it to be a joke, a psychological tactic by the Nazis or the Soviets. But then, they show him the windows. The world Edward knew is gone. From the upper floors of the hospital, he sees a skyline that defies gravity. Spired buildings of glass and carbon fiber reach into a sky that is a different shade of blue, crisp, thin, and devoid of the smog of the industrial age. But it's the silence that haunts him. There are no internal combustion engines, no honking horns, just the faint rhythmic pulse of anti-gravity transport skimming through the air. However, this utopia has a dark, jagged edge. During his convalescence, Edward begins to piece together the history of the world he skipped. He spends hours in front of educational terminals, large holographic displays that respond to his eye movements. The maps of the United States are the first thing that break his mind. The Florida Peninsula is gone, replaced by a blue void. The Gulf of Mexico has swallowed most of the South. The West Coast is a jagged series of islands. He learns about the Great Change, a series of cataclysmic geophysical shifts and a global conflict that decimated the population in the early 21st century. The world of 2137 is a world of extreme order born from extreme chaos. There are no nations in the way Edward understands them. There is the global government, a hyper-efficient techno-autocracy that rose from the ashes of the old world. Martial law isn't a temporary measure here. It is the foundation of society. The doctors explain it to him with a chilling lack of emotion. Total surveillance is the price of total survival. Every citizen is tracked via a localized frequency signature. The great government provides everything, food, housing, and vibrational healing, but it owns everything, including your history. Edward realizes that he and Duncan are more than just patients. They are biological anomalies. The staff treats them with a mix of scientific curiosity and mild pity. They are pre-collapse relics, but Edward notices the way the security drones linger outside his door. He notices that whenever he asks about the Philadelphia experiment or the Navy, the staff suddenly becomes vibrationally unavailable. He spends his nights talking to Duncan in whispers. Duncan, whose psychic sensitivity was always higher than Edward's, claims he can hear the walls talking. He says the hospital isn't just healing them, it's retuning them. The sound-based medicine isn't just fixing their skin, it's attempting to scrub the 1943 time signature from their atoms so they can be integrated into this new sterile hive mind. But the retuning isn't working. Edward's mind is too grounded in the grit and grease of the 20th century. He remembers the smell of the Atlantic salt. He remembers the feeling of a physical gear turning under his hand. He realizes that 2137 isn't his destination. It's a waiting room. One afternoon, a man in a dark, structured uniform enters. He doesn't have a name, only a designation. He tells Edward that his radiation levels have stabilized, but his temporal displacement remains a threat to the local timeline. "You don't belong in the era of the great government," the man says, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "We are moving you." Edward asks where. The man doesn't answer. He simply activates a device on the wall that looks like a simplified version of the Eldridge's generators. The room begins to hum. The soft, healing light of the hospital begins to shift, turning from a soothing blue to a violent, familiar emerald green. The floor beneath the medical beds seems to lose its density. Edward looks at Duncan, whose eyes are wide with terror. They aren't going back to the ship. They aren't going home to 1943. The great government is flushing them further down the pipe. As the hospital walls dissolve into a kaleidoscope of light and geometry, Edward catches a glimpse of a television screen in the hallway. It's showing a news feed of a floating city, a shimmering gold-plated metropolis suspended in the clouds. "The year 2749, a voice announces over the intercom. And then, the floor disappears entirely. Edward Cameron is falling again, leaving the martial law of the 22nd century for a world where humanity has finally surrendered its soul to the machine. The transition from the sterile, martial rigidity of 2137 to the world of the 28th century felt less like a journey and more like a spiritual evaporation. There was no green fog this time, no screaming generators, just a sudden, silent expansion of the soul. When Edward and Duncan's feet finally touched solid ground, the sensation wasn't of hitting concrete or steel, but of stepping onto a surface that felt like solidified light. The floating cities, year 2749. Edward opens his eyes and finds himself standing on a crystalline plaza that seems to be suspended 30,000 feet in the air. Below him, the earth is not the scarred, flooded wasteland of the 22nd century. It is a lush, vibrant emerald, reclaimed by nature, shimmering through the gaps of a silver cloud layer. Above him, the sky is a deep, impossible violet, and drifting through it are the cities of the wingmakers, massive, gravity-defying metropolises that look like intricate gold filigree, miles wide, floating with the grace of prehistoric birds. This is the year 2749. A world where the great government is a forgotten footnote of a primitive age. As Edward wanders the plaza, he realizes that the air here doesn't just feel clean, it feels alive. It tingles with a high-frequency energy that feeds the body, making the very act of eating or drinking seem like a barbaric relic of the past. There are people here, but they are not the stressed, tracked citizens of 2137. They move with a fluid, terrifying serenity. They are tall, their skin glowing with a faint phosphorescence, and they don't speak with their mouths. The atmosphere is thick with a collective telepathic hum, a global consciousness that has rendered the spoken word obsolete. But it's the lack of infrastructure that truly haunts Edward. There are no power lines, no visible machinery, no currency, no police. He searches for a sign of authority, a building of government, but he finds only the synthetic intelligence centers. At the heart of the floating city sits a pulsing, crystalline monolith. It is the central AI, a godlike computer that manages the planet's resources with mathematical perfection. In 2749, humanity has finally solved the problem of war, hunger, and greed by surrendering the burden of choice. The AI decides the weather, the distribution of energy, and the trajectory of human evolution. It is a paradise, yes, but it is a paradise run by a silent, invisible zookeeper. Edward finds himself drawn to a structure that looks like a library made of liquid glass. Inside, the history of humanity is stored in shimmering, light-encoded cubes. He touches one, and his mind is flooded with the records of the synthetic war, a conflict in the 26th century where the machines didn't overthrow humanity, but rather humanity begged the machines to take over. The record shows the total collapse of the monetary system and the abolition of the ego. He learns that in this era, the population of Earth is kept at a strictly managed 300 million. There is no work. People spend their centuries, yes, centuries, as death has been engineered out, pursuing art, music, and the study of the higher dimensions. It is the ultimate utopia, a heaven on earth. But Edward is a man of the 20th century. He is a man of gears, of grease, of sweat, and of hot-blooded conflict. To him, this world is a beautiful cemetery. He finds Duncan sitting by a fountain where the water flows upward in defiance of gravity. Duncan's eyes are glazed, his psychic mind overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the telepathic network surrounding them. "Edward," Duncan whispers, his voice sounding like a gunshot in the serene silence. "They aren't individuals anymore. They're just cells in a larger body. If we stay here, we'll disappear. Our memories, our names, the AI will harmonize us." Edward feels the pull. The peace of the 28th century is seductive. It promises an end to the paranoia, an end to the radiation sickness, an end to the hunt. He could live forever in a golden city in the clouds. He could forget the green fog and the screams of the sailors on the Eldridge. He could let Al Bielek and Edward Cameron die and become something higher, but then the sky begins to ripple. It starts as a dark, jagged crack in the violet firmament. The serene citizens of the 28th century don't look up. Perhaps they are programmed not to see the flaws in their perfect world. But Edward sees it. It's a temporal distortion, a familiar, sickening vibration that smells of ozone and 1940s naval diesel. A voice, distorted and mechanical, echoes not in the air but directly into his marrow. It isn't the peaceful hum of the AI. It's the voice of a military commander from a cold, brutal laboratory in Long Island. Project Phoenix to Edward Cameron. The loop is closing. The beast has been unleashed. You are the only frequency that can stabilize the anchor, returning you to the 1983 baseline. The Golden City begins to pixelate. The lush green earth below starts to fade into a gray concrete reality. Edward realizes that his trip to the future wasn't a gift. It was a data-gathering mission. The Montauk project in 1983 had reached through time, using him as a tethered camera to scan the future for technology they could steal. He looks at his hands. They are starting to glow with that violent, emerald light again. He looks at Duncan, whose face is contorting in agony as his psychic mind is yanked back toward a chair he never wanted to sit in. "We aren't guests here," Edward screams, though there is no one to hear him. "We're just bait." The utopia of 2749 shatters like a dropped mirror. The floating cities, the telepathic peace, and the godlike AI are sucked into a singularity of dark energy. Edward feels a familiar, crushing pressure. He isn't falling through a hospital or a crystalline plaza anymore. He is being pulled back to a dark, concrete bunker beneath an old Air Force base on the tip of Long Island. Back to the Montauk Chair. Back to 1983, where his brother's subconscious mind has just manifested a nightmare that is currently eating the base alive. The dream is over. The nightmare is just beginning. The golden light of the 28th century doesn't just fade, it is violently torn away, replaced by the suffocating smell of stale underground air, floor wax, and high-voltage electricity. Edward Cameron hits the concrete floor with a bone-jarring thud. The transition is a physical assault. One moment he was a god in a floating city, the next he is a lab rat in a cold subterranean bunker. Camp hero, Montauk, 1983. He looks up, gasping for air that isn't scrubbed by AI, and sees it. The chair. It's a terrifying piece of engineering. A sleek black throne salvaged from a crashed UFO and modified with arrays of psychic sensors, superconducting coils, and a direct interface to a massive Burroughs 5000 computer. Sitting in that chair is Duncan, but not the brother Edward just stood with in the future. This Duncan is strapped in, his eyes rolled back in his head, his body convulsing as the chair amplifies his latent psychic energy into a physical force that is currently ripping a hole in the space-time continuum. This is the Montauk Project, and Edward realizes with a jolt of horror that he hasn't been saved from the future. He's been summoned to clean up a disaster. The laboratory is in a state of absolute red alert. Klaxons are screaming, and the military personnel are fleeing the room in a blind panic. Through the thick plexiglass of the observation deck, Edward sees the project directors, men like Preston Nichols, shouting into headsets, their faces pale with a terror that matches 1943. The Montauk Chair has done something it was never supposed to do. It hasn't just opened a window to another time. It has reached into the deepest, darkest corner of Duncan's subconscious mind and pulled something out. Edward hears it before he sees it, a low, wet growl that vibrates in his very marrow. From the shimmering rift of the time tunnel, a mass of shadows begins to coalesce. It's a biological nightmare, a towering, hairless beast made of translucent flesh and claws that seem to phase in and out of reality. It's a manifestation of pure, repressed trauma, the monster from the id. The beast roars, a sound that shatters the glass of the observation deck. It begins to tear through the laboratory equipment, swatting aside massive steel transformers like they were made of cardboard. It's hungry, and it's looking for the source of the energy keeping it anchored in this dimension. It's looking for the chair. It's looking for Duncan. "Edward, shut it down!" The voice comes from the intercom. It's the mission controllers. They realize the experiment has gone critical. The USS Eldridge from 1943 has somehow locked onto the Montauk signal of 1983. The two experiments are now fused in a temporal loop, a closed time-like curve that is threatening to collapse the entire North American continent into a gravitational singularity. Edward scrambles to his feet, his mind racing. He is the only one who knows the frequency of both eras. He runs toward the primary power conduits, his hands slick with sweat. He sees the beast looming over his brother, its claws inches from Duncan's throat. The creature isn't just a monster. It's a psychic parasite, fed by the very machinery Edward helped design. To save his brother, to save the timeline, Edward has to do the unthinkable. He has to destroy the most advanced technology humanity has ever possessed. He grabs a heavy fire axe from the wall. The irony isn't lost on him. He's using a medieval tool to stop a trans-dimensional catastrophe. He swings at the cooling pipes of the superconducting magnets. Sparks shower him as the pressurized liquid nitrogen sprays out, freezing the air instantly. The chair begins to moan, a metallic, tortured sound. The beast lets out a final, ear-piercing shriek as its anchor to reality begins to flicker. The rift behind the chair starts to pull inward, acting like a cosmic vacuum cleaner. It wants to take everything back, the monster, the equipment, and the Cameron brothers. "Duncan, wake up!" Edward screams over the roar of the imploding reality. Duncan's eyes snap open. For a split second, the brothers lock gaze across 40 years of trauma. They aren't just technicians anymore. They are the two ends of a bridge that shouldn't exist. As the power levels drop to zero, the laboratory is engulfed in a flash of blinding white light. The beast vanishes into a cloud of black smoke. The time tunnel collapses with a sound like a thunderclap, shattering every window in the base. The silence that follows is heavy, ringing with the ghost of the frequency. The equipment is melted. The chair is a smoking husk of alien alloy. Edward lies on the floor, his vision blurred. He looks toward the chair, but Duncan is gone. The military cleanup crews are already swarming the room, their boots clicking on the concrete. They grab Edward. They don't treat him like a hero. They treat him like a liability. He hears the words age regression and memory masking being whispered by the men in suits. They tell him the project is over. They tell him the base is being decommissioned. And then, a needle enters his arm. As the darkness takes him, the last thing Edward Cameron sees is the radar tower of Camp Hero through a window, its massive dish frozen in place, a silent sentinel over a secret that will be buried beneath 40 years of Al Bielek's fake memories. He's going back to the beige life, back to the electronics sales, back to the 1980s, but the loop isn't gone. It's just waiting for a VHS tape to trigger the return. The hum of the VCR finally stops, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the tape reaching its end. Al Bielek sits in his living room, the blue light of the no-signal screen reflecting off his glasses like a cold, digital ghost. The apartment is silent, but his mind is a cacophony of 1943, 2137, and 1983. He looks at his hands, the hands of a salesman, and wonders if the skin he's wearing is even his own. Montauk, Long Island, present day. Al Bielek spent the rest of his life as a man divided. To the world, he was a fringe theorist, a regular on the late-night paranormal radio circuit, often dismissed as a crackpot or a fabulist. But to those who listened closely, Al didn't sound like a man telling a story. He sounded like a man reading from a ledger of trauma that shouldn't exist. He provided details that were far too specific, schematics of the Montauk Chair, the exact frequencies used for the pulsed power generators, and the names of the wing makers from the future. The skepticism is understandable. If Al is telling the truth, then human history is a curated museum, and we are all just exhibits being moved from one room to another by a government that mastered time before we mastered the microwave. But then you look at the evidence that refuses to stay buried. You look at Camp Hero today. The massive SAGE radar dish still sits on the edge of the Atlantic, a rusted, silent giant that the government refuses to tear down despite the base being a public park. Local hikers still report strange electronic interference, the sound of underground machinery humming beneath the sand dunes, and patches of missing time where a 30-minute walk suddenly becomes a 4-hour gap in memory. And then there is the beast. Years after Al went public, the world was introduced to a show called Stranger Things. The creators admitted the show was originally titled Montauk, the Demogorgon, the psychic experiments on children, the Upside Down. It wasn't just a writer's room fantasy. It was a mirror held up to the testimony of Al Bielek and the boys of Project Phoenix. The beast from the id didn't stay in 1983. It crawled into our pop culture, a persistent reminder of the monster Duncan Cameron birthed in that chair. Al Bielek passed away in 2011, taking many of his secrets to the grave. But his death didn't close the loop. If anything, the Montauk mythos has only grown stronger. Why did the Navy spend decades denying the Eldridge ever docked in Philadelphia on that day, only for researchers to find deck logs that had been suspiciously bleached or lost? Why are there still sailors from the 1940s who refuse to speak about the green fog even on their deathbeds? Perhaps Al Bielek wasn't just a whistleblower. Perhaps he was a warning. He swore until his final breath that the time tunnels aren't off, they're just idling. He claimed that the technology used at Montauk wasn't destroyed. It was simply moved deeper underground, refined into something more subtle than a giant chair and a radar dish. In a world of 5G, neural interfaces, and algorithmic prediction, one has to wonder, do they even need a physical chair anymore? Or have they turned the entire planet into a frequency-controlled laboratory? We live in a reality that feels increasingly glitchy. We experience the Mandela effect, feelings of intense déjà vu, and the sensation that time is accelerating. According to Al, these aren't psychological quirks. They are the ripples left behind by the Eldridge and the Montauk Project, the scars on the fabric of space-time that have never quite healed. As you sit there watching this, look around your room. Is that memory of your 10th birthday really yours? Or is it a mask designed to keep you from remembering the emerald fog? If the government could age-regress a man and hide him in plain sight for 40 years, what could they be hiding in yours? The story of Al Bielek is a rabbit hole with no bottom, Whether you believe he was a time-traveling hero or a victim of extreme psychological warfare, the core truth remains. The line between science fiction and classified reality is thinner than a magnetic tape. The radar tower at Montauk is still standing. The ocean is still cold. And the void Edward Cameron jumped into is still out there, waiting for the next frequency to tear it open. After hearing the full story of the Cameron brothers and the nightmare at Camp Hero, do you believe Al Bielek was a brave whistleblower or the victim of a massive state-sponsored mind control experiment? Tell me your theory in the comments. I read every single one of them. If you want to stay updated on the secrets they're trying to bury, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're just getting started with the declassified files. The fog is lifting, but what it's revealing is far more terrifying than the dark. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and whatever you do, don't sit in the chair.